Okay, so we've got demand, we've got supply, so let's put them together and explain how wages are determined. So I'm not going to spend very long on the early bit, simply because it's the same as we did with equilibrium for supply and demand. Yeah, so there's your quantity of labour, there's wage, yeah, there's the demand for labour, there's the supply of labour, and we know that if wages were up here, there'd be, if wages were at W1, there'd be excess supply. Supply would be S1, demand would only be D1. There's too many workers looking for jobs, essentially there'd be unemployment. That would drive down wages. Workers would compete with one another, to try to undercut other workers. Down here at W2, lots of firms want to employ people, but nobody's willing to work at that wage. So firms will have to offer higher wages to be able to get the workers that they need. And as a result, down here wages are pushed up there wages are pushed down, and we arrive at equilibrium at WE, with a quantity of labour QE. So it's the same as we did with supply and demand. So a more interesting question is how do we use that? How do we use it to explain why some people earn more than others? So we know that in a free market, we have a relatively free market, and we know that some jobs are paid far, far more than others. So why might that be? So it's got to do with kind of both elasticity of supply and demand and restrictions on supply and demand. So let's think firstly about the desirability of jobs. Some jobs, as we were arguing before, are far more desirable than others. Let's suppose that we could work as a beach lifeguard on the one hand, or we could work as a toilet cleaner on the other. Well, obviously, if these paid the same wage, if both these jobs offered you the same wage, then what would happen is that everybody would leave toilet cleaning. Supply of workers would leave toilet cleaning, and they would all go and become beach lifeguards. So what would have gradually happened is that more and more people would go and work as beach lifeguards, and as a result, the wages would get pushed down. So when would people stop leaving toilet cleaning? The answer is when the wages of toilet cleaners are sufficiently higher than beach lifeguards to cancel out the fact that this isn't a very nice job. So we'd end up with a situation like this, where, again, we'll assume other things being equal, demand is similar. There's your quantity of labour, there's your wage, quantity of labour, there's your wage. What we're saying is that the supply of toilet cleaners, workers into that sector is relatively low, whereas lots of people want to be beach lifeguards because it's a nice, easy job. So therefore, wages for toilet cleaners are up there, wages for lifeguards are down there, and the gap is basically the compensation for doing an undesirable job. So that distance there, X, is the difference. But basically, it's saying that because this is not a nice job, that's a nice job. You have to be compensated, for doing the bad job. And that actually has a name in economic theory. You don't need to know this, but it's called the Equalizing wage differential. Now then, if this was true, completely true anyway, then what that would mean is that nice jobs get paid not very much, and nasty jobs all get paid lots. That's partly true. So mining jobs, for example, they have high wages, because they're pretty dangerous. People won't do them unless they're compensated. But that's not true. That's not true for all jobs, because it's not necessarily the case that you can simply find a high-paid job and go and do it. We could all say, well, look, you look at Premier League football players. They're all paid huge quantities of money. Why don't we all go and do that? And the answer is because we can't. So we're saying one factor, is the desirability of a job. Because what that does, the desirability affects supply. But secondly, we might also say, well, it's not just about the desirability of the job, it's about flexibility. is it possible to move from one job to another? And that can affect supply as well. So if we were to look at, say, doctors and nurses, then we'd say, if we look at the market for doctors and we look at the market for nurses, for the minute, let's assume that demand is the same. That the demand for nurses is the same as the demand for doctors. In fact, I'll just do it on one diagram actually. So let's suppose that this is just the demand for health professionals, nurses and doctors. But what we know is that to become a doctor, a doctor requires at least 7 years training, whereas to become a nurse, you're generally looking at about 3 years of training. So it must be the case, therefore, that the supply of doctors is both more limited and more inelastic than the supply of nurses. So therefore, because the supply of doctors is lower than the supply of nurses and more inelastic, the wages for doctors outweigh the wages for nurses. Why don't nurses just head off to become doctors? Because they can't, because they need qualifications that they haven't got, and it would take years to get them. So there are certain jobs where there are inflexibilities that stop people from moving. Trades unions can do the same thing. So they can restrict the supply of workers into a particular job. The London Underground, the tube, in London is notorious, for unions, basically making it very, very difficult for jobs, to be even advertised to people outside of the business already. So one factor can be desirability, two can be flexibility, and there's lots of other things that come into that, but qualifications, training, so some of those factors we talked about affect labour elasticity are going to come into that as well, restricts the supply. And finally, we might add into this, this whole doctor-nurse debate, we might also add in labour demand. So, a third factor might be the demand, within a particular job. And within that, you can also include discrimination. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But again, if we take doctors versus nurses, then what we know is that doctors, they've had more extensive training, and therefore they have overall, other things being equal, they have probably higher skill levels. They can probably do most of the things that nurses can do, and some other things as well. At a given wage, therefore, who would you rather have, a doctor or a nurse? You'd rather have a doctor. So at that wage, you might say the demand for doctors is there, but the demand for nurses is only there. At a lower wage, you'd still want more nurses than you would at a higher wage, but you'd still prefer a doctor to a nurse. So therefore the demand for nurses looks like that, the demand for doctors looks like that. If we then put on top of that the supply that we just talked about, we said that the supply of doctors was inelastic and restricted, whereas the supply of nurses was more elastic and less restricted, then the equilibrium in the market for nurses is down there at WN, whereas equilibrium in the market for doctors is up here at WD. So therefore, we can see that wage differentials, they occur for a whole variety of reasons, both on the supply and the demand side. I mentioned a minute ago discrimination. Part of the reason, so we know that in certain jobs, men are paid more than women. Part of the reason for that is discrimination, because we might say, well, look, there are there are equally qualified men and women doing a particular job, but if it's the case that employers decide that they prefer men to women for no good reason other than the fact that they are discriminatory, then men are going to have a higher wage than women. So there's a whole variety of different ways in which we can use equilibrium here to explain why it is that some groups have higher wages than others. It's a mix of supply and demand factors. Supply factors, therefore, splitting into the desirability of the job on the one hand and the ability, elasticity, flexibility of being able to supply on the other. And then there's fundamental underlying demand based on how much value you add as a worker, or possibly linked to things like discrimination.